Thou art giving and forgiving, ever blessing, ever blessed, wellspring of the joy of living, ocean depth of happy rest. You may be seated. In the creation narrative that Genesis paints for us, there is this common refrain that accompanies each stage of creation, and it is this: it is good. Actually, that's way too flat a translation from the original Hebrew. The Hebrew is exuberant. It's like a big exclamation point. It is very good, and it's repetitive, and it says good, good, it's very, very good. It's doxology. It's joy in the wholeness of what God has intended for the world to be. And yet, when you move from the first chapter to the second, this refrain of it is good all of a sudden stops. And we just heard it if we were listening to the Genesis lesson. God looks at the Adam. By the way, it's not just some dude named Adam. The Adam means the human. At this point, he encompasses all of humanity. In this way, he's every man and every woman. And God looks at the Adam alone, and the refrain abruptly ends and changes to, it is not good that the human is alone. And so God, in order to bring wholeness to his good creation, gives the Adam a partner, gives Adam Eve. And from there springs, of course, the human family. It is not good that the Adam, the human, is alone. We live in a time where we couldn't be more connected. I mean, somebody can get a hold of me for good and oftentimes for bad very, very quickly, and I'm sure you too. I mean, I've gone as far as buying an Apple Watch, meaning that somebody, which oftentimes happens, it's usually my heathen brother-in-law, but will text me right in the middle of even a sermon. I'm getting messages as I'm delivering a message. And yet, in this day and age, as you well know, people feel amazingly isolated from each other, distant from one another. The mental health crisis in America is going through the roof. There are studies that are out there that I pay attention to as a father that says that there is a direct correlation between when our children and us, by the way, get active on social media and are given these smartphones, that their mental health starts to deteriorate. That they, all of a sudden, I guess by judging them off against somebody's, the one picture that they took out of all of the 1,000 selfies, that they had to get the one good one, they think that they don't add up. And somehow, this has affected our ability to be citizens with one another. In our politics, we're atomized. And we're not just people who disagree over ideological lines or can even have a good argument anymore. No, we want to destroy each other. The other person is my enemy. And we have retreated into information bubbles that only reaffirm our own worldviews, and we don't have common spaces. The Adam is alone. And it is not good. I want you to notice that you are sitting in one of the last spaces in America that actually forces us to deal with each other. The church in America, of course, is on the decline. It's slipping off of people's consciousness of something that they think is important or vital to their life. And I'm a partisan here, but I don't think it's a coincidence that with all of these institutions devolving, being given up on, not being taken care of, people not thinking that they really need the discipline of community life, where we have to interact and deal with one another, that at the exact same time, we feel more isolated, more alone. And we lack the gentleness and kindness and just decency that comes when you're forced to deal with each other. It's not good for the human to be alone. In the gospel story, Jesus is talking about divorce, and certainly for those families out there who've been touched by divorce, as my own family has, these words sound harsh and hard and very much not like what we would expect from the graciousness that we usually hear from Jesus. But I actually think it has a huge amount to say to us today. You have to understand divorce back then, there's a hint in it with the very question. So how did the question start? By Pharisees going to test Jesus. So there's a clue right there that this is not about really divorce and the people involved in that. This is a theological fight, a theological test. And the question is it okay for a man to divorce his spouse, his wife? Now, right there is a big old hint from that time and age of what is being dealt with when you deal with divorce. It wouldn't have made any sense at all if they said, is it okay for a wife to divorce her husband? Because that was not allowed. But a man could divorce his wife without cause, for no reason, and without a social safety net in that culture. She was, absolutely left behind in society. Her parental rights were non-existent. She didn't necessarily have to be taken care of, and so she could be placed into tremendous poverty. But she's not being thought about by anyone in this equation except Jesus. And so Jesus takes what to our modern ear sounds like a harsh stand, but it's a harsh stand for justice for her, so that you can't just put her aside. But let's back up to the original intent of the conversation to begin with, because it was a theological fight, a theological test. And it's precisely these sorts of fights, whether they be theological or ideological or political in our day and age, that we have fights that don't even care about the people's lives that we're fighting about. That is a stain on our humanity. In fact, it dehumanizes us. It's inhumane. It takes away and strips away at the wholeness and goodness that God intends for us. And yet, again, when you look at our society, you look at the way that we do our ideological and political fights anymore. We don't care about the people being hurt by this. All we care about is winning. And very much, when that's happening in Jesus' day, he steps back and says no to that way of engaging one another. And then, in this weird twist, he takes children and he blesses them. And what's that about? Well, it's about seeing who's oftentimes in that world left behind, seeing who's not being seen, seeing people as vital and important even when the world doesn't think of them in that way. And my friends, I want to suggest to you that not only is the place that you're sitting a place that allows for the Adam not to be alone anymore, for community to happen, but it's also one of those last places in our society that at our best we're able to talk with each other in disagreement. You likely are sharing a pew with somebody who you couldn't imagine why they would dare vote the way that they did, or think how they think. And yet here we are, one with another, in this place, trying to say, yes, there are ideological differences in our world. Yes, there are things that have to be dealt with, and sometimes there's going to be great disagreement. But what we cannot lose sight of is each other, is humanity. We have to learn how to be human and know that we have need of each other to be whole. I have, because stewardship season is upon us, been thinking and writing a lot over the last few weeks about what it means to be a steward. Now, when we say this in the church, it's stewardship season, everybody goes, okay, well, that's a great day to miss church. Some Sundays I don't need to do that because what they're trying to do is make a budget. And of course, there's no way of getting around that. It's true. We have to make a budget. The light company likes us to pay with something other than prayers. So all of that is necessary. And yet what really stewardship should be about, and I've been thinking for my own life, is what does it mean for me to be a steward of those vital things in my life? What does it mean to be a steward as a father and a husband? A steward of the relationships that God has given my life? What does it mean to be a steward as a clergy person who has the responsibility of holding all of this together? Speaking of iPhones and smartphones, did you know your iPhone just had an update and there's a new thing on it called screen time? And what it's going to do is tell all of us how much we're on our screens and what we're doing while on our screens. And this is horrifying to me. I bet if you think about it, it should be to you. Because what it's going to do, probably for a lot of us, is indict us as not great stewards of our time. And if you were to have this sort of screen time for our society right now, about what our society spends its time and its energy and its resources on, I think it likewise would be devastating. Because somehow we've slipped into some way of acting where we're majoring on the minors and we're minoring on the majors. In fact, we're not being good stewards of the majors. And what I want to invite you to during this stewardship season is to be reflective on all the callings of your life, the things in your life over which God has called you to be a steward. Your relationships, what makes your creation and your portion of it good and whole and right. In the next chapter of Genesis, there's that portion that's commonly called the fall. It comes about because of not listening to the ways of God, and its consequences continue to this day. In essence, each and every one of us stand there and grab the fruit and eat of it in our own way. And think about what happens when the fruit is eaten. The man and the woman want to hide themselves. They feel shame about who they are. They hide themselves as well from God. They feel alienation from God. They turn on one another. They're alienated in their relationships. And the consequences of it, we're told that creation isn't going to be this good, hospitable place for them anymore. They're alienated from a good creation. And even one of the great joys of life, which is having children, that there's going to be pain involved in that. And so they're alienated generationally. And all the ways that this good world can become undone, it is happening for them. And yet, although Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a big fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, well, guess what? Jesus can. And so Jesus came, as Paul said, as a new Adam, a second Adam, And in his own life and ministry, he is overcoming all of those ways of being alienated. And so people who are alienated from their good sense, he exercises that out of them and restores them fully. Those who are alienated across all kinds of lines, even in his own group of disciples, the zealots fighting Rome and the tax collectors taking taxes for Rome, he puts them together and overcomes the alienation of strife and division. The alienation from God, he is restoring people to God's community over and over and over again. And as he calms the seas, he overcomes the alienation from a good creation. As he welcomes the children, he overcomes the generational alienation that plagues us as well. My friends, this community follows in Jesus' healing ways. We have the capacity for offering these same gifts of healing and wholeness to the world. But I will tell you, we must not take it for granted. We must be good stewards of what God has given us here as well at St. John's. And so I do ask you to make a pledge to this church. I ask you to pledge yourself in all the ways that you can pledge yourself to the good work that is done here. Because, as we saw this weekend, on Friday night, the beauty of music was presented here. Yesterday in the ordinations, when servants, these young, they weren't young, but these men and women who gave their lives in service to the diaconate, in other words, they're never going to get paid for being ordained to the deacons in our church. They're just going to give that gift to the world. And they did it here yesterday. And then on 2 p.m., I did a funeral for somebody that died tragically and dealt with the suffering family that was here. This is just a snapshot of a weekend that happens in this church. We can look at the world and say, it is not good. Adam is isolated and alone. But if we're stewards of those communities of wholeness, and we pledge ourselves to making sure that they're there for the future generations, I assure you that doxology will come again, and a restored heaven and earth is possible, even through the likes of Jesus working through us. Be faithful. Be stewards of your life. Amen.